My husband accused me of cheating in front of 42 people, a string quartet, and a wall of white roses he hadn't paid for himself. That's what most people would probably remember. The flowers, the gasps, the champagne going still in crystal glasses while a man in a custom tuxedo stood in the middle of his own anniversary party and told everyone his wife had betrayed him. But what I remember first is the phone in his inside jacket pocket. The wrong phone. Slim. Black. No case. Hidden where Mason never kept his real one because his real one practically lived in his hand. I only noticed it because he pulled his blazer open too fast when he turned toward me. Dramatic and righteous, and already halfway in love with the scene he was creating. I had found that burner phone 3 days earlier under the false bottom of his leather weekender. That was the part he didn't know. He didn't know I had already seen the messages between him and Piper Quinn. Didn't know I had read the photos they staged. The hotel receipts they thought were clever. The drafts of emails they planned to discover. The timeline they built around my so-called affair with Graham Sutter, our family attorney. Vidover. And one of the only men Mason had never been able to charm into stupidity. Mason thought tonight was his masterstroke. He thought he was going to break me in public. Hand me humiliation dressed as moral outrage. And then walk the room through his grief, like a man forced into cruelty by betrayal. He thought if he said the word cheating loudly enough, nobody would ask why my supposed affair happened to become visible right before he pushed for a revised post-nuptial agreement and control over my mother's trust. He thought he was the only person in that ballroom holding evidence. He was wrong. The party was at the Bellermont Hotel. In the old gold ballroom with chandeliers like upside-down kingdoms and waiters trained to disappear during upper-class disasters. 8 years of marriage. That was the official excuse. In truth, Mason loved any event where expensive people were trapped long enough to admire him. My mother, Lydia Ward, had paid for most of it without saying so. Because that was her way. Quiet wealth, quiet corrections, quiet generosity extended far past the point of wisdom. She still believed, even after everything, that if you gave a man enough grace, he might eventually decide to deserve it. Mason had spent the last 4 years proving otherwise. When he took the microphone from the bandleader, I knew instantly something was wrong, not because I didn't trust him. Not anymore. But because I understood performance too well. There's a particular look men like Mason get when they believe they're about to control a room. Their faces go solemn in a rehearsed way. Their shoulders broaden. Their voice drops into something tender enough to sound wounded and sharp enough to cut with. He tapped the mic once, smiled sadly. The quartet fell silent. Conversation around the room thinned into curiosity. Then stilled. "Elena," he said, turning toward me with those practiced dark eyes. I didn't want to do this tonight. There it was. That opening line. Not confusion. Not questions. A script. I was standing near the floral wall in midnight blue silk. One hand still around a champagne coupe I hadn't really been drinking from. Watching my husband begin what he thought would be my burial. Piper Quinn stood 6 feet behind him in silver satin. One hand lifted to her throat like she'd been shocked by what she was about to help frame. She had always overacted. Even in text, my mother was at table 3 beside Graham Sutter. Both of them suddenly very still. Mason inhaled once. The way men do when they're about to lie beautifully. "I have spent months trying to protect my wife's dignity," he said. "But when betrayal reaches a point where silence becomes self-destruction, a man has to tell the truth." A murmur passed through the room. Not because they believed him. Because rich people love a catastrophe most when it arrives wearing formal clothes. Then he turned and pointed at me. Not wildly. Deliberately. "At some point during this marriage," he said, "Elena stopped being my wife and became someone else's one." There it was. The accusation hanging bright and poisonous in the center of the ballroom. A few women gasped. One man actually set down his drink. Someone near the doors whispered, "Oh my God." Piper lowered her eyes at exactly the moment she must have practiced. Graham didn't move at all. I did. I looked down. Once. At the line of Mason's jacket where the burner phone pressed faintly against the fabric. Then I looked back up at my husband. The thing about being framed is that the first blow only lands if you don't already know where it came from. Mason kept talking. Hotel receipts. Emotional distance. Late meetings. Carefully implied intimacy with Graham. Just enough to poison the room without committing to anything he couldn't later dress up in legal caution. He even reached into his pocket then. Triumphant. For what I assumed were the printouts from the burner phone folder, labeled Evidence, E. That was when I nearly laughed. Because his hand touched the wrong side of the jacket first. Because for half a second panic flashed through his eyes before he corrected it. Because my husband, standing in front of everyone we knew and lying about my betrayal, had momentarily forgotten where he'd hidden the very device that could destroy him. He finally pulled out a white envelope instead and held it up like a priest displaying sin. I have proof, he said. Of course he did. So did I. And as the whole room held its breath, waiting for me to break, deny, cry, scream, or beg, I simply set my glass down on the nearest tray, folded my hands in front of me, and thought, go on. Mason, show them what you brought. Then I'll show them what you forgot. The thing about men like Mason Holt is that they only look powerful if you meet them after the room has already decided to admire them. If you catch them early enough before the tailored jackets, before the polished grief, before they learn how to borrow their wives' stability and call it charm, you can see the machinery underneath. The hunger, the vanity, the endless, exhausting need to be the most compelling person in every room, even if someone else had to build the room for him first. I met Mason at a charity planning dinner. My mother insisted I attend 5 years before the anniversary party. Lydia Ward funded half the arts board in our county and quietly kept the other half from collapsing under people who loved galas more than budgets. She had old money in the most dangerous form, disciplined, unshowy, and immune to flattery. My father had been dead 3 years by then. And my mother was still in that phase of grief where she confused gentleness with generosity and generosity with wisdom. She thought Mason was refreshing. That should have worried me sooner. He was handsome in the way men are when they've had practice being watched. Not breathtaking. More strategic than that. He knew how to listen with his whole face. How to make older donors feel witty. Younger women feel seen. And anxious men feel taller than they were. The first night we met, he asked me 3 questions about the foundation's operating structure and remembered all the answers. At the time, that felt rare. Later, I understood it differently. Mason was never interested in people first. He was interested in access. People were just the doors. I had grown up as Lydia Ward's only child, which meant 2 things happened to me very early. First, people assumed I would either become soft under money or hard under scrutiny. Second, I learned to say very little and watch very carefully. By the time I married Mason, I had already spent years making other people underestimate me on purpose. My mother owned property, trusts, quiet board seats, and enough private capital to rescue small companies without ever appearing on a panel about female leadership. We were never flashy. That was the whole point. Lydia believed noise was what people made when they had no real control. Mason loved noise. Not literal volume. Emotional noise. Attention. Presence. Atmosphere bending toward him. At first, it was easy to mistake that for confidence. He came from good enough money. Not legacy money. The kind of background that teaches men 2 dangerous habits. Mason had worked in development. Then, private client strategy. Then floated close enough to legal adjacent deal work to sound informed over cocktails without ever building anything solid enough to survive audit. He knew donors. Junior partners. Event chairs. Boutique consultants. And exactly how to say the words, long-term positioning, like they meant he belonged near power. My mother tolerated him, then liked him. Then, against instincts she would later privately admit were right. I trusted him. That was where everything began to tilt. Because once Mason understood that Lydia Ward's affection came with institutional gravity, he changed. Not suddenly. Men like him never change suddenly. They refine themselves around opportunity. He became more attentive around my mother, more publicly devoted to me, more careful with his drinking, his spending, his temper. He learned the names of my father's old friends, started mentioning family continuity in rooms where trust administrators could hear him, asked smart questions about philanthropic vehicles, estate planning, intergenerational stewardship. He made himself useful. That is the stage where manipulative men are most dangerous. Not when they're cruel, when they're valuable. For the first 2 years of marriage, I helped him more than I should have. Not with cash. With access to seriousness. I let him sit in on meetings where real people made real decisions. Introduced him to counsel who didn't indulge nonsense. Corrected his language in private before he embarrassed himself in public. Smoothed over his impatience. Softened his ego. Explained family structures he had no natural instinct for. I thought that was marriage. Or maybe I thought loyalty could civilize appetite. It can't. It only teaches appetite where the silver is kept. The first time I felt something go wrong was over a postnuptial draft. Not because I objected to the concept. My mother believed in paper the way some people believe in prayer. But Mason's interest in the structure of it was too hungry. He asked not just what was protected, but what triggered review. Not just what stayed mine, but what became contestable under emotional negligence. Reputational harm. Breach. Public embarrassment. Public embarrassment. That phrase stayed with me. Later came the smaller things. Cash withdrawals, he explained too smoothly. Sudden concern with my calendar. Questions about where I was. Who I lunched with. Whether Graham Sutter still handled my mother's trust matters personally. His irritation whenever I spoke to Graham too long at dinners. Despite the fact that Graham was old enough to have known my father, and serious enough not to flirt with oxygen. And then Piper Quinn appeared. Young enough to be decorative. Smart enough to be useful. Reckless enough to believe secret things stay secret if the right people are doing them. Mason thought I wasn't paying attention. That was his first true mistake. Because by the time he stood in front of that ballroom pretending to be the wronged husband, I was no longer the wife he thought he had trained into quiet. I was simply a woman waiting for him to finish lying in public, so I could decide exactly how much truth the room deserved. The real humiliation wasn't that Mason accused me of cheating. It was how carefully he staged it. Anyone can throw an accusation across a kitchen counter. Weak men do that every day. But Mason wanted witnesses. He wanted chandeliers, string music, old money, and enough expensive people in one room to make shame feel official. He wanted my mother at table 3. He wanted Graham Sutter close enough to be seen but far enough away to look suspicious. He wanted Piper Quinn in silver satin with a face arranged into injured surprise. He wanted me dressed beautifully so the contrast would sting harder when he called me disloyal. Cruelty like that is never accidental. It's architecture. He stood in the center of the ballroom with the microphone in one hand and the envelope in the other. And for a moment I could almost admire the discipline of it. Almost. He had timed the accusation after dinner service but before dessert. When people were settled enough to listen and sober enough to remember. The quartet had just finished a slow arrangement of something classical and forgettable. Waiters lingered at the edges with champagne they no longer dared to pour. The white roses my mother paid for glowed under the chandeliers like innocence no one in that room deserved. "Elena," he said. "And if you hadn't known him..." His voice might have sounded broken. That was the danger of men like Mason. Their ugliest work always arrived dressed as injury. "I tried to protect you," he said into the microphone. "I tried to give you a chance to tell the truth privately." A murmur moved through the room. Not support. Interest. There is a difference. And people like Mason count on no one noticing it. He opened the envelope slowly. letting paper make its little ceremonial sound. Then he held up 3 printed photographs between 2 fingers so the nearest tables could see. I knew those photos already. That was the thing. One showed me stepping out of the side entrance of the Blackthorn Hotel 2 weeks earlier. Alone. Technically. But framed so tightly, it looked clandestine. Another showed Graham Sutter entering the same hotel 32 minutes later. The third showed us in the lobby 3 nights after that. Standing near each other with our heads bent in conversation. No kiss. No touching. No actual intimacy. Just the kind of sequence weak minds mistake for proof because somebody printed it on expensive paper. Gasps came anyway. Not from anyone who knew me. From the guests who liked the theater of scandal more than the burden of judgment. One woman put her fingertips to her pearls. A hedge fund donor I recognized from one of my mother's galas leaned toward his wife and whispered something with the bright, a vulgar focus of a man who had just been handed entertainment better than dessert. Mason lowered the photos 1 inch. Just enough to keep them visible. I didn't want to believe it. He said. There are lies so polished they almost become art. He was in love with this one. I looked at Graham then. He had not moved. That was one of the things I would remember later with a kind of gratitude. He didn't rush to defend himself. Didn't leap up in outrage or point or shout or try to rescue me. He knew exactly what Mason was doing. And he understood the first rule of surviving a frame. Do not give the liar more motion to shape. Piper, on the other hand, played her part exactly as rehearsed. She stood near the floral wall with one hand to her throat and her expression arranged into sympathetic horror. As if she had been dragged unwillingly into the tragedy of my moral collapse. If I had not already seen her messages on the burner phone, I might almost have believed she was embarrassed to be there. But I had read everything. I knew about the fake hotel setup. The prepaid room never used. The stage timing. The photographer Mason hired through a third-party events contact who thought he was documenting blackmail evidence for a discreet husband. The draft messages between Mason and Piper where she said, "Make sure Lydia is seated where she can see Elena's face when you say it." The note where Mason replied, "Graham has to be in the room or it won't land." That last one had stayed with me. It won't land. As if my life were not a marriage but a presentation. Mason kept going. You all know Graham Sutter has been close to this family for years. He said. That's part of what makes this so disgusting. There it was. The turn. He wasn't just accusing me of betrayal. He was poisoning every relationship in the room that had once made me feel safe. Graham wasn't merely my supposed lover. He was family counsel. My late father's friend. My mother's legal advisor. By dragging him into it, Mason wasn't trying to prove I had cheated. He was trying to isolate me from the last structures that weren't his. And then he delivered the line that made the whole thing unforgivable. I was willing to stay silent, he said, until I realized she meant to make a fool of my entire family. His entire family. Not our marriage. Not our vows. Not the truth. His humiliation. That was the engine of the entire spectacle. A wife's alleged betrayal was, in his mind, terrible chiefly because it reflected badly on him. I think that was the moment something in me stopped hurting and started becoming useful. Because once pain turns useful, it becomes very hard to beat. He set the microphone down on the nearest table and stepped toward me with the envelope and the photos. Righteous and shaking in exactly the amount he must have practiced in a mirror. There were tears in his eyes now, but not enough to fall. Mason had always understood optics better than emotion. Elena, he said. Lower now. For me and for the room at once. Tell them I'm wrong. I looked at the photos. Then at the outline of the burner phone inside his jacket. Then at my mother. Sitting very still at table 3. Then back at my husband. He wanted denial. Panic. Begging. A scene he could frame as guilt unraveling. Instead, I asked the only question that mattered. Do you want to use the phone in your jacket? I said. Or should I? The room went dead. And for the first time that night, Mason Holt looked surprised. Mason's face changed so fast it was almost vulgar. That was the first satisfaction of the night. Not the silence in the ballroom. Not the way Piper's hand dropped from her throat because she forgot. For one fatal second. To keep acting. Not even the guests leaning forward in their chairs like people at the theater who suddenly realize the play has turned on its lead actor. No, the first satisfaction was seeing my husband, who had spent weeks staging my humiliation, lose control of his own expression. "What phone?" he asked. Too quickly. Too sharply. And there it was, the oldest mistake liars make when they panic. They answer the wrong question. I had not said your burner phone. I had not said the black phone in your jacket. I had said the phone. And Mason, in his fear, had supplied the rest. Around us, the room stayed perfectly still. The quartet had gone silent enough that I could hear one of the violinists shift her weight. Somewhere near the back of the ballroom, a waiter lowered a tray onto a side station because even he understood something important was happening now and didn't want the cutlery shaking in his hands to interrupt it. My mother had not moved from table 3. Graham Sutter was still seated beside her, one hand folded over the other, as calm and unreadable as ever. Piper. Though Piper was beginning to crack. She had been beautiful all evening in that polished, strategic way women become when they've decided beauty is a form of leverage. Silver satin. Careful makeup. Hair pinned just loosely enough to imply softness while still surviving the entire night. But now the softness was gone. What was left was a young woman who had expected a performance and found herself in a collapse. I looked at Mason and said nothing. That was the point. People always imagine power is what you say next. Sometimes it's what you refuse to rush into saying. Mason tried to recover. Of course he did. Men like him are never more alive than when trying to climb out of a lie they thought was airtight. Elena, he said. Voice lower now, strained into caution. If you're trying to distract from what you did, it's not going to work. I could have answered then. I could have walked straight to him, reached into the inside pocket of his tuxedo jacket, and pulled the burner phone out in front of every donor, trustee, cousin, and old money busybody in that ballroom. I could have shattered him quickly, but quick endings are mercy. And I wasn't feeling merciful. Instead, I bent down. I picked up my champagne coupe from the tray where I'd set it, and took one small sip. Not because I wanted it, because the motion was calm. And calm is the one thing a liar can't fight in public. A whisper moved through the room. That whisper mattered too, because people no longer knew who the victim was supposed to be. Mason followed my eyes then. Just briefly. Toward the line of his jacket. Instinct. Tiny. But visible. Another mistake. I smiled. Not warmly. Just enough. You should stop talking, I said. He laughed. But there was no ease left in it. You don't get to dictate terms here. There was the arrogance again. The need to own the room. Even while it was slipping away from him. I set the glass down. Then I stepped toward him. Not fast. Not dramatic. The hem of my dress moved over the ballroom floor like ink. And the crowd parted almost without meaning to. That's what people do when they sense truth coming toward a liar. They make space without ever admitting they chose a side. Mason held his ground. Or tried to. Up close. I could see the pulse in his throat. Too fast now. The tiny sheen of sweat near his hairline. The raw calculation in his eyes. He was trying to decide whether I knew everything or only enough to be dangerous. Good. Let him calculate. I'm trying very hard, I said quietly. So only the first 2 rows and the nearest standing guests could hear. To decide how much dignity I'm still willing to leave you with. That landed. He flinched, not physically. Not enough for the room to call it that. But in the face. A small collapse around the mouth. And because panic makes cowards reckless. He made his next move. He reached for my wrist. Not violently. Worse than that. Intimately. As if he still had the right to touch me in front of witnesses and steer the narrative back through proximity. As if being my husband still meant he controlled the frame. I stepped back before his fingers closed. Then I looked at his hand. Then at him. Then at the room. No, I said. Just one word. But it changed everything. Because now the story was no longer about alleged cheating. Now it was about a husband publicly accusing his wife. Trying to physically rein in her when she challenged him. And visibly sweating through a tuxedo while she remained calmer than he was. My mother stood then. That was the first movement she had made since Mason took the microphone. Lydia Ward rose from table 3 in black silk and old money restraint. And the room felt it. Not because she needed to save me. Because her standing meant something had crossed from personal ugliness into family war. Mason saw her too. That was when true fear entered his face. I looked him dead in the eye and said, very softly, "You should take your hand out of that pocket before I do it for you." The first layer of truth was the phone itself. Not what was in it. Not yet. Just the fact that it existed. Mason kept his hand in his jacket pocket for 1 second too long after I told him to take it out. That was enough. The room saw it. Maybe not everyone understood what they were looking at. But people are far more sensitive to hidden guilt than they like to admit. He had spent the last 10 minutes performing righteous devastation over my supposed betrayal. And now, suddenly, his entire body was organized around protecting something inside his own tuxedo. That contradiction did more work for me than any speech could have. My mother was still standing at table 3. Graham had risen now too. Not toward us. Not yet. But with the kind of measured alertness men wear when they know a situation is turning legal, whether the people in it understand that or not. Piper had stopped pretending to be shocked. Her face had gone pale in that flat, expensive way women go pale when they realize beauty will not save them from evidence. Mason tried one last time to speak over reality. "This is insane," he said. "Elena, you're unraveling because you got caught." No. That line was too late. Not because it was weak. Because the room had already moved past the accusation and into pattern recognition. People had seen him touch the wrong pocket. Seen the fear. Seen me stay calm. Once a liar begins looking more fragile than the person he's accusing, the story starts peeling away from him. I tilted my head slightly. "Then take it out." He didn't move. That was layer 1. If he had pulled the phone immediately and shown the room an ordinary device, he might still have salvaged confusion. But hesitation is confession's dumb cousin. The longer he stood there protecting the pocket, the more the ballroom understood that whatever was in it belonged to him. Not me. I could have ended it then. Reached forward. Taken the phone. Opened the screen. Read the messages out loud. Piper's name. The hotel plan. The fake timestamps. The draft subject lines. I can't keep sneaking around like this. If Lydia finds out, we're done. Make sure Graham is visible in the room. Every cheap little brick in the trap he had laid for me. But I didn't. Because the second layer of truth mattered more than the device. I had found the burner phone 3 days earlier while unpacking Mason's weekender after a supposed overnight strategy retreat in Charlotte. He had come home tired in that theatrical way he used when he wanted credit for working hard near wealth. The bag smelled wrong. Not perfume exactly. New electronics. Plastic heat. I found the false bottom because I had spent 5 years married to a man who always hid his real appetite one layer beneath whatever he wanted the room to see. Inside was the phone. A charger. 2 folded receipts. One from Blackthorn Hotel. One from a floral supplier I knew had not serviced any event of mine. I did not confront him. That's what he would have expected from the old version of me. The wife shocked by evidence. The woman who still believed betrayal required immediate emotion. But once you've spent enough years around manipulative men, you learn that confrontation is often the first gift you accidentally give them. It lets them rehearse, deny, reframe, adapt the lie. So I charged the phone instead. New passcode. That was his arrogance. Men like Mason always build complicated emotional traps and then leave the evidence carelessly protected because they can't imagine the women around them being cold enough to inspect before crying. The messages with Piper filled the screen first. Then the photo folder. Then the notes app. That was layer 2 of truth. This wasn't merely an affair. It was a strategy. Mason and Piper had not stumbled into each other and then panicked. They had planned a narrative. A moral one. He would be the wronged husband. I would be the distant wife who turned to Graham. Piper would remain conveniently peripheral. Sympathetic. Loyal. Horrified. If the room played its part correctly, Mason could leverage the public shame into private concessions. Reputational pressure. Trust negotiations. Control over family-facing decisions. A rewritten postnuptial agreement. Maybe even soft influence over my mother's holdings if he could make me look unstable enough. Guilty enough. Ashamed enough. That was what he wanted. Not freedom. Position. The third layer of truth came from the Notes app. Not romantic lines. Not self-justification. Logistics. Need Elena isolated from Lydia before accusation. Photos first. Then hotel receipts. Push emotional angle. Not legal. If she denies. Ask why Graham was at Blackthorn. Do not mention burner, if necessary. Say, private investigator. That was when I understood the full insult. He wasn't just trying to frame me for cheating. He was trying to manufacture my guilt so cleanly that even my denial would help him. Every answer I gave would already have been anticipated. Every reaction categorized. Crying would look guilty. Anger would look guilty. Silence would look guilty. He had designed a trap where I would lose simply by behaving like a wounded wife. So I chose not to be one. Back in the ballroom, I looked at Mason's pocket. Then, at his face. Then I gave him the only mercy I still had available. I already found it, I said quietly. The room went so still I could hear someone at the back inhale. Mason's eyes changed. That was layer 3. Not exposure. Recognition. He knew then that whatever script he had written for the night was dead. And for the first time since he lifted the microphone, my husband understood the most dangerous fact in the room. I was not reacting to the trap. I had been waiting for him to step into it. Piper broke first. Not openly. Not with a scream or some dramatic confession that let everyone in the ballroom feel morally clean for witnessing the truth arrive. Women like Piper rarely shatter that generously. They fracture in smaller, meaner ways. A hand that drops too fast. A gaze that cuts toward the wrong person. A face that forgets which emotion it is supposed to be wearing. When I said, I already found it, her eyes flew not to me, not to Mason, but to the inside of his jacket. That tiny movement did more damage than any speech could have. Because now the room had a direction. Not certainty yet, but direction. People who had spent the last 5 minutes pretending to process my alleged betrayal were suddenly staring at the line of Mason's pocket like there might be a living thing in there. One older woman near the dance floor whispered something sharp to her husband. Graham Sutter, still standing by my mother's table, finally moved his gaze from Mason's face to the jacket. And I could almost feel the legal arithmetic beginning behind his eyes. Mason heard the shift too. That was the beginning of the panic. Not the accusation failing. Not even the danger of exposure. Panic begins when a manipulative person realizes the audience has stopped listening through them and started looking around them. He laughed. Of course. Too hard. Too late. That brittle. Masculine laugh men produce when they know the ground is moving, but still hope volume might pass for certainty. Elena, he said, shaking his head like I was embarrassing myself now. Whatever you think you found. You are not going to hijack this by making things up. Making things up. Interesting choice of language from a man standing under his own lies like they were chandeliers. My mother took one step forward from table 3. That was all. No speech. No dramatic maternal defense? Lydia Ward did not waste movement, but everyone in that room knew what her stepping closer meant. The matter had crossed from ugly marital spectacle into family consequence. Mason saw it too. And then, because fear makes stupid people even more theatrical, he made the second mistake. He reached into the wrong pocket. Just for half a second. Reflex. Self-protection. But the room saw it. His hand darted toward the inside left breast of his jacket before he corrected course and grabbed the envelope instead. That tiny movement cracked the whole performance. Even people who didn't know what they were seeing knew they had seen guilt. I tilted my head and said nothing. That silence was doing better work than words. Piper finally spoke then, desperate to repair the story before it caved in completely. "Mason," she said softly. In that breathy, supportive voice she must have practiced. "Maybe this isn't the right time to... Oh, that was beautiful. Not because she helped me, because she helped herself too, obviously. Until that second. Most of the room could still have read her as a bystander. Maybe even a horrified friend caught in collateral damage. But now she sounded invested. Protective. Familiar in the wrong direction. The kind of familiar no assistant, donor, or neutral guest should have with a grieving husband in the middle of exposing his wife. My mother's eyes went to Piper. That was all it took to make Piper go pale enough to look dusted over. Mason heard the danger in her voice too late. "No," he said sharply, turning on her with more irritation than affection. "She doesn't get to do this. She... Not Elena. Not my wife. She..." The ballroom caught that too. The shift in power was almost physical now. People who had leaned toward him in sympathy minutes earlier were straightening up. As if distance might protect them from having misjudged the room. Two of my mother's board friends had stopped pretending to whisper and were simply watching. One of Mason's golfing donors looked actively annoyed not at me, but at the possibility he had worn black tie to a setup that was unraveling badly. And still, Mason kept talking. That was what doomed him. People imagine liars fall when they are disproven. Often they fall because they cannot stop trying to control the story, after control has already left them. "You've always done this," he said to me. Voice rising now. "Every time you're cornered, you go cold and superior and act like everyone else is insane. That doesn't change what you did with Graham." There was the next layer of panic, improvisation. He had stopped following the script. That mattered because the script was probably the only part of this he had prepared carefully. Everything after fear entered him was instinct. And instinct is where the truth leaks out of bad people. Graham finally spoke. "Be very careful," he said. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't move toward us. He didn't defend himself. Which was exactly why the sentence landed like a blade. It was not outrage. It was warning. Legal. Moral. Personal all at once. Mason turned toward him with the kind of fury weak men reserve for the one person in the room they know they can't out-talk. "You stay out of this." Graham's expression didn't change. "I have," he said. So far, that one sentence rearranged the room again. Because now people understood something else. Graham had not leapt up in self-protection because he did not need to. Men who are innocent and well-positioned do not scramble. They wait for liars to overextend themselves. Mason was overextending now. He looked back at me. Then, at my mother. Then down just once toward the line of his jacket where the burner phone sat, like a second heart beating too fast. I almost pitied him. Almost, because this was the moment he finally understood what I had done by staying quiet since finding the phone. I had not confronted him. Had not warned him. Had not given him a chance to adapt the lie. I had let him build the whole stage. Summon the audience. Raise the microphone. And accuse me under crystal and white roses. Then I had simply waited. That is what truly frightened him. Not that I had evidence. That I had known and still let him begin. And once a manipulator realizes the person he meant to trap has been standing calmly inside the trap the whole time. Panic becomes visible in every part of him. Mason's breathing changed. So did the room. The scandal was no longer mine. It had started migrating, and everyone could feel where it was going. The reveal happened because Mason finally made the one mistake desperate liars always make. He touched the evidence. Not enough to pull it out. Just enough to prove it existed. His fingers pressed against the inside of his jacket again when Graham told him to be careful. And that tiny protective motion, so fast most people would have missed it in an ordinary room, became enormous in a ballroom already straining to understand where the truth had gone. I saw my mother see it. More importantly, I saw 3 attorneys from her foundation board see it too. That was when I stopped protecting the remains of the evening. I stepped closer. The hem of my dress brushed the polished floor. Mason's breath was too quick now. Piper had gone absolutely still. The way people go still when they realize they are standing at the edge of a cliff they helped build. The envelope with the fake photos hung limp in Mason's hand. Suddenly reduced from weapon to prop. "Elena," he said. And now his voice was quieter. Harsher. No longer for the room, but for me. "Stop?" "No." That word rose in me with perfect clarity. I looked him in the eye and held out my hand. "Give it to me." He actually had the nerve to frown. As if I were the one violating boundaries. "You're not touching me," he said. That did it. Not for me. For the room. Because everything in that sentence betrayed him. A husband publicly accusing his wife of adultery should have wanted proof seen. Wanted truth confirmed. Wanted the object in question displayed. Examined. Believed. Instead, Mason was suddenly defensive. Territorial. Almost frightened. He wasn't protecting dignity. He was protecting an item. My mother crossed the distance then. Lydia Ward never hurried. Even now, she didn't. She walked like a verdict taking shape. When she reached us, she did not speak to Mason first. She looked at me. "Is this what you found?" she asked. I nodded once. That was enough. Mason's face lost the last of its color. Not because my mother was loud. Because Lydia Ward was not a woman people ignored when she became precise. She had funded half the hospital wing in this county. Buried 1 husband. Survived 3 hostile probate challenges from men who mistook grace for softness. And could dismantle a liar with less wasted energy than most people use to stir coffee. "Mason," she said, finally turning to him. "Take your hand out of your jacket." He smiled then. A strange smile. Thin. Cornered. The smile of a man who realizes every graceful exit has closed and decides ugliness may still be survivable. "This is insane," he said. "All of you are going to stand here and indulge this instead of addressing the fact that she's been sleeping with him?" He pointed at Graham. That was his last real play, dragging the accusation back into the center before the room could fully reorganize itself around his guilt. It might even have worked if Graham had flinched. If I had protested too emotionally. If my mother had let the moment widen into family chaos. Instead, Graham reached into the inside pocket of his dinner jacket and calmly pulled out his phone. Then he spoke for the first time in a voice loud enough for the whole ballroom. "I have every message Mason Holt sent me over the last 6 weeks asking me to step aside from trust administration so he could simplify Elena's decision-making during a difficult marital season." The room changed. Not subtly this time. A woman near the stage gasped outright. Someone at table 8 actually said, "Jesus." One of Mason's donors stepped back as if proximity itself had become compromising. Graham looked at the phone in his hand. Then at Mason. "I declined," he said. Repeatedly. Then, 2 weeks ago, Mason asked whether I had a regular suite at the Blackthorn because he wanted to send something private there. I found that odd enough to save. Mason stared at him. I could almost hear the trapdoors breaking open underneath him now. That was when I reached forward. Fast enough that he didn't expect it. Clean enough that it didn't look like struggle. My fingers slid inside the open line of his tuxedo jacket and came back with the black burner phone before he fully reacted. For 1 second, All of us froze. The phone sat in my hand like a confession made solid. Mason lunged then, finally losing all discipline. Give me that. My mother stepped between us. Not dramatically. Not protectively. Just with the cold efficiency of a woman who had decided the man in front of her no longer counted as family. Do not touch my daughter again, she said. He stopped. Because now the room could see it all at once. The fake grief. The staged photos. The panic. The hidden phone. The hand he kept trying to put on me, as if possession might still function where truth had failed. I turned the phone on. New passcode. Still. Of course. I opened the message thread at the top. Piper. Make sure Lydia sees Elena before you say Graham's name. Mason. That's the point. She'll freeze. And the room will decide for her. Piper. What if Elena denies it? Mason. Then I show receipts and cry if I have to. The silence after that was not silence anymore. It was collapse. I didn't read everything. I didn't need to. The room had already arrived. Still. I scrolled once more. There were the hotel receipts. The stage timeline. The photographer. The note labeled, Postnup Aftermath. Piper's anxious question about whether Mason was sure the cheating angle would hold. Mason's response. I held the phone up slightly, not for spectacle. Just enough for the nearest tables to see the glow of the screen in my hand. Then I looked at my husband. You weren't framing me for cheating, I said. You were trying to price my humiliation. Piper broke then. Don't put this all on me, she said suddenly. Voice high and raw. You said she'd sign if she thought her mother believed it. There it was. The rest of the room didn't need me anymore. Mason turned toward her like a man being stabbed by the wrong accomplice in the wrong church. Shut up. Too late. Far too late. Because now the whole ballroom understood the final truth. This wasn't a broken husband exposing betrayal. This was a failed opportunist using sex, shame, and spectacle to get his hands deeper into my family's money. And he had chosen the one room full of witnesses from which there was no surviving version of innocence. Mason's collapse wasn't loud at first. That's what surprised me. People like him spend years cultivating presence so carefully that you expect the fall to be theatrical too, shouting. Denial. Broken glass. Some ugly little operatic scene that lets everyone else in the room feel superior and clean. But real collapse, especially in rooms full of wealthy witnesses, usually starts smaller than that. It starts with abandonment. The second Piper said. You said she'd sign if she thought her mother believed it. The room stopped belonging to him. You could feel it happen. Not in one sound. In 100 tiny withdrawals. A donor couple near the dance floor stepped away from Mason as if scandal were transferable through proximity. One of the trustees, who had laughed too loudly at his stories all year, suddenly became fascinated by the stem of her champagne glass. 2 men from the arts board began whispering, not gossip. Not now. But the clipped, efficient kind of whisper people use when they're already deciding how to describe the event later in a way that leaves their own judgment intact. Even the waitstaff changed. That was the detail that stayed with me. They stopped hovering near him. Service workers always know first when power has turned. Piper's breakdown had cracked the final layer. Up until that moment, Mason might still have tried to crawl toward ambiguity. Marital pain. Miscommunication. Emotional overreaction. Something ugly but survivable. But now his motive was out in the air. Simple and filthy. Not wounded honor. Not betrayal. Not heartbreak. Leverage. He wanted me ashamed enough to sign. That made him smaller in a single instant than any accusation ever made me. Mason looked at Piper with a kind of hatred only cowards feel toward accomplices who panic on schedule but confess too early. You stupid, he began. Then stopped. Because he remembered the room. Because men like Mason always remember the room. Even while they're dying in it. He turned back toward me, trying to recover some final version of dignity. But the pieces no longer fit. The photos in his hand now looked ridiculous. Cheap. Performative. The envelope drooped at his side. His righteous husband act had collapsed so completely that even his posture seemed embarrassed to still be attached to him. "Elena," he said. And there it was again, that soft, private voice he used when he wanted to make cruelty sound intimate. "Whatever you think this looks like." I almost smiled. Whatever you think this looks like? As if the room required imagination anymore. My mother took the burner phone gently from my hand. Not because I couldn't hold it. Because Lydia Ward understood optics better than Mason ever would. Evidence carries differently when a mother, a widow, and the primary trust holder receives it in silence from her daughter after being publicly asked to watch that daughter be humiliated. She handed the device to Graham. "Secure it," she said. That was all. No scream. No scene. Just the clean transfer of evidence from family to council. That did more damage than rage could have. Mason saw it too. The second Graham closed his hand around the phone. This stopped being a marital fight and became legal terrain. And Graham Sutter, unlike Mason, lived very comfortably on legal terrain. "I want copies of everything preserved immediately," Graham said. Not to Mason. To Lydia. To me. To the room. Really. Messages free. Drafts. Receipts. Metadata. And any associated financial transfer records connected to Piper Quinn. Piper made a small sound at that. Fear. Finally stripped of vanity. Because now she wasn't a pretty accessory in a tragic scene. She was a co-conspirator with traceable transactions. Mason's voice rose. "You're blowing this out of proportion." No. That line actually drew something close to disgust from the room. You could feel it. The shared revulsion of privileged people who will tolerate cruelty. Affairs. Greed. And emotional rot, but hate above all, being manipulated into participating in someone else's fraud. My mother turned to him then. I had seen Lydia Ward furious twice in my life before that night. Both times, she had become quieter, not louder. Her anger never spilled. It condensed. "You used my money," she said, "to pay for a party where you intended to publicly break my daughter's name so you could negotiate against her shame." Mason opened his mouth. She lifted one hand. He stopped. That was the real end of him. Not because she silenced him. Because he obeyed. All evening. He had been acting like the room was his to conduct. But when Lydia Ward raised one hand, the reflexive truth of the hierarchy showed itself. He was still just a man who had married into the wrong family and mistaken patience for weakness. "I don't want to hear another word tonight unless it is addressed through counsel," she said. Around us, the ballroom had gone absolutely still. The quartet stood frozen near the stage. Instruments lowered. The chandeliers kept glowing as if nothing had happened. White roses climbed the walls my mother had paid for. And beneath them, Mason stood in a tuxedo he suddenly looked too small to deserve. Then came the final humiliation. Not from me. From the room. One by one. People turned away from him. Not dramatically. Nobody booed. No one pointed. That would have made it easy, something he could later call cruel. Hysterical. Undignified. Instead, the people who mattered simply withdrew recognition. The trustees moved toward my mother. The donors approached Graham. A cousin I'd known for years crossed the floor and put an arm around my shoulder without saying a word. No one went to Mason. Not even Piper. Especially not Piper. She had backed 3 full steps away from him by then. Mascara beginning to pull at the corner of one eye. The silver satin of her dress suddenly reading less like elegance and more like costume. Mason saw that too. And finally, stripped of witnesses, stripped of sympathy, stripped of performance, he looked exactly what he was. A man who had tried to sell my disgrace and had mispriced his own. He took one step toward me. Maybe to plead. Maybe to threaten. Maybe simply because he had no idea where else to go. Don't, I said. Just that. And for the first time in our marriage, he listened immediately. Security arrived 10 minutes later at Graham's request. Quiet men in black suits. Discreet enough to protect the hotel. Firm enough to protect the evidence. They did not drag Mason out. They didn't need to. Men who have already been emptied by a room walk themselves differently. He left the ballroom slower than he had entered it. Without the microphone. Without the envelope. Without the audience. And as the doors shut behind him, I realized something almost peaceful. He had wanted to make me the scandal. Instead, he had become the cautionary tale. The first thing I got back was not my reputation. It was my mother's eyes. After Mason was escorted out, after Piper disappeared behind a wall of frightened excuses and hotel security, after the quartet quietly packed their instruments, because even musicians know when a room has crossed from celebration into legal memory, I turned toward Lydia. She was still standing exactly where she had stood when Mason began his performance. Black silk, straight spine, face calm enough to terrify anyone who understood her. For one suspended second, neither of us moved. Then she crossed the ballroom and touched my cheek. That nearly undid me. Not because I was fragile. Because all night Mason had tried to force my mother into a role, witness to my shame, judge of my guilt. Pressure point inside his strategy. He had built the whole spectacle on one poisonous assumption that if he made me look dirty enough in public, Lydia Ward would do what too many powerful families do when scandal appears. She would protect the institution first. The money, the optics, the image. Instead, the first thing my mother did after his collapse was look at me, the way she had when I was 10, and bloodied my knee, falling off a horse. Not embarrassed. Not disappointed. Not confused. Protective. That was what he had never understood. He had spent 5 years around quiet wealth and still failed to learn the simplest truth about it. Women like Lydia Ward do not panic over scandal. They study motive. My God, she said softly, thumb once against my cheekbone. How long did he think he could do this to you? Not what happened? Not why didn't you tell me? Not how could you let this happen? Just that. How long did he think he could do this to you? That was the first restoration. Because in one sentence, my mother returned me to myself. I was no longer the woman accused. No longer the wife under suspicion. No longer the body onto which Mason tried to pin his performance of betrayal. I was the wronged one. Clearly. Finally. Publicly. Around us. The ballroom had shifted into a different kind of motion. Now, quiet clusters. Low voices. People standing too close together because they knew history had just happened and wanted to make sure they were arranged correctly inside it. Graham was already speaking with 2 board members and my mother's private counsel. One of the hotel managers stood near the entrance, looking pale and eager to please, in exactly the way expensive venues do when they realize one of their event hosts has just become evidentiary. And me? I was suddenly tired. Not weak. Not broken. Just emptied of the energy it takes to survive a lie once the lie is dead. My mother felt it before I said anything. She always did. Come upstairs, she said. Now, the Bellermont kept a private lounge suite above the ballroom for patrons my mother underwrote often enough that the staff treated her presence there like weather. By the time we stepped inside, someone had already sent tea, water, cold cloths, and a tray no one expected either of us to touch. Graham came in 2 minutes later with the burner phone sealed in an evidence pouch and the fake photographs inside a leather folio as if they might contaminate the furniture if left exposed. Again, that mattered. Because what Mason had tried to make intimate marital betrayal, private shame, womanly guilt had now become procedural, structured, readable, small. Graham set the pouch on the low table between us. Everything is preserved, he said. Cloud sync included. Piper was careless. Mason was arrogant. Between the messages? financial transfers, receipts, and notes. There's enough here to kill any claim he tries to make. Any claim. I sat down slowly and looked at the sealed phone. So much ruin in such a small object. Then, I asked the question I had not been able to ask in the ballroom, because asking it there would have given Mason too much intimacy back. What did he think I'd do? My mother and Graham exchanged the briefest look. Graham answered first. He thought you'd panic. My mother added. He thought shame would make you negotiable. There it was. The real injury named cleanly at last. Not that Mason thought I'd cheated. He didn't. Not for 1 second. He thought I could be cornered into behaving like a guilty woman because guilty women surrender faster. They sign more quickly. They apologize for things they didn't do just to make the looking stop. They let men rewrite money, space, and future in exchange for being allowed to breathe privately again. That was what he had tried to purchase with public humiliation. My silence. My leverage. My name. I looked at my mother then. Really looked at her. At the steadiness. At the anger she kept folded so cleanly into control. At the terrible tenderness of a woman realizing the son-in-law she had tolerated was not merely selfish or vain but strategic in his cruelty. I should have told you sooner, I said. Lydia shook her head once. No. He should have feared you sooner. That was the second restoration. Not comfort. Not forgiveness. Respect. There is a particular kind of healing that happens when the people who love you refuse to frame your endurance as passivity. My mother was not asking why I stayed. She was asking why he mistook my patience for surrender. The conversation after that became practical. As it always does in serious families once the emotional truth is clear. Graham would file for immediate preservation orders and emergency separation of trust-related discussions from marital access. Mason's name would be removed from any discretionary family review structure before morning. Piper would hear from counsel before she heard from him. The hotel footage would be secured. Guest lists preserved. Statements controlled. All of that mattered. But not as much as the final thing my mother said before midnight. When the ballroom had been emptied, and the roses downstairs were already starting to wilt under lights, no one was admiring anymore. She took my hand once, firm and warm, and said, "You are not leaving this night as his accused wife." She looked at the evidence pouch, then back at me. "You are leaving it as Lydia Ward's daughter." And for the first time since Mason lifted that microphone, I understood exactly what I had taken back. Not just truth. Position. He had tried to strip me in public. Instead, he had publicly returned me to the one name he could never morally afford to gamble against. Đã xong phần 9, chờ lệnh tiếp tục để viết phần 10. 6 months later, I signed the final divorce order in Graham Sutter's office, while rain tapped softly against the windows, and nobody pretended the word love belonged anywhere near the paperwork. That felt right. Mason had tried to end our marriage under chandeliers. With white roses, staged grief, and an audience large enough to turn accusation into currency. He had wanted spectacle. He had wanted my shame to become leverage. He had wanted one beautiful, humiliating night to do the legal work he was too weak to earn honestly. Instead, the real ending came in a quiet room with clean lines, black ink, and a witness who understood exactly what had been destroyed and what had been saved. Mason looked older by then. Not tragic. Not ruined in the dramatic way people like to imagine when a manipulative man finally loses. He still wore good suits, still carried himself like someone who believed posture could survive truth. But he looked diminished in the way men do when enough rooms have stopped rearranging themselves around them. That was the thing he never recovered from. Not the money, though. He lost more access than he ever expected. Not the affair, though. Piper disappeared from his life. The second counsel got involved, and bank records started mattering more than attraction. Not even the divorce itself. What he lost, permanently, was interpretive control. Once people saw what he had done, they could never again look at him first and ask, "How does Mason feel?" they had to ask. Instead, what is he trying to shape? That is a terrible way for men like him to live. It strips the glamour from their suffering. It makes every display suspect, every grievance strategic, every sadness just another possible instrument. And because that was true, the rest of the collapse happened quietly and efficiently. My mother removed him from every family-adjacent decision structure before the month was over. Trust access, gone. Advisory presence, gone. Event chair influence, gone. Introductions that once came easily through my marriage to him stopped arriving. Not because Lydia waged some loud social war she never needed to, but because women like her know how to close a gate without ever touching it in public. Graham's legal work was even cleaner. The burner phone yielded everything. Metadata. Transfers. Drafts. Receipts. The photographer's invoice. Piper's reimbursements hidden under event consulting. Notes about timing the accusation to coincide with the post-nuptial discussion. Mason's own words. Preserved in blunt digital stupidity. Laying out the exact shape of his plan. Isolate Elena. Damage Elena. Shame Elena. Negotiate. That documentation did not simply save me. It corrected the record. That mattered more than revenge ever could. Because scandal fades. Stories twist. People get lazy with memory when enough time passes and the room grows hungry for a new disaster. But documents remain. Timelines remain. Truth, once structured properly, becomes difficult to sentimentalize. At the final signing, Mason tried just once to speak to me privately. Graham had stepped out to take a call. My mother was in the reception room reviewing a property note on her tablet. The rain was steady. The papers sat between us. I was angry, Mason said. I almost laughed. Not because it was absurd. Because it was so small. After all the planning, all the staging, all the white roses and fake sorrow and strategic humiliation, his explanation had shrunk to a man's favorite shelter. Anger. As if anger had purchased the burner phone. As if anger had drafted the notes. As if anger had told Piper when to gasp and where my mother should be seated. As if anger had created the folder labeled Postnup Aftermath. I looked at him for a long second and realized something simple. I no longer needed him to understand the scale of what he had done. That is one of the least romantic but most liberating truths in the world. Closure is often just the moment another person's self-explanation stops being relevant to your life. You weren't angry, I said. You were entitled. That hit him harder than if I'd called him cruel. Because cruelty can still feel grand to the cruel. Entitlement is smaller, pitié, more embarrassing. It reveals that beneath all the performance and appetite, what really drove him was the belief that my name, my money, my mother's trust, my silence, and my body were all resources he could reposition if he became cornered enough. He looked down then. Not in shame. Mason never truly had that. In defeat. Good. I signed. So did he. And that was that. The truer ending came later. These days, my mother and I have dinner every Sunday, not because tragedy made us sentimental, because disaster made us more honest. She asks sharper questions now. I answer them more directly. We don't confuse grace with blindness anymore. The first time we hosted a dinner after the divorce finalized, she had a florist ask whether we wanted white roses. My mother said no so quickly it almost sounded like laughter. We chose gardenias instead. Small thing. Deep thing. I kept the burner phone for a while after the case closed, not active. Not charged. Just sealed in a file box in the back of a locked cabinet. Not as a trophy. As a reminder of what people will build when they think your shame is cheaper than your resistance. Of how elaborate cruelty becomes when it believes it is still smarter than the woman it intends to corner. Then one afternoon I finally handed it to Graham for permanent archive disposal. I didn't need it anymore. That was the new order. Not that Mason was gone. Not that the room had turned on him. Not even that I had won. It was this. I no longer organized my life around explaining myself to lies. I no longer measured a room by whether it admired me. I no longer mistook patience for obligation. And I no longer confused being quiet with being powerless. Sometimes, late, I still think about that ballroom. The quartet gone silent. The white roses glowing under hotel lights. Mason in black tie, holding fake evidence in one hand and real guilt in the other. The moment he thought he had me trapped. And I think about the truth that saved me long before anyone else in that room knew it. He believed public humiliation would make me smaller. He never understood that by the time he raised the microphone, I had already found the phone, read the script, and stepped emotionally outside the trap. That is why he lost. Not because I outshouted him, because I outweighted him. And when the lights came back on, the woman he had tried to bury was still standing there calm, named correctly, and far too intact to negotiate from shame.